The cold did not just live outside, it crept into the bones, lingered in the chest, and whispered through every breath that winter was unlike the others. The snow seemed heavier, the wine sharper, and even the silence carried the weight of despair. In a world where warmth was not just comfort, but survival, the fragile flame of life burned low in a wooden hut on the edge of a forgotten medieval village. Inside, a family huddled together, their bodies pressed, so close that heartbeat met heartbeat, fear met fear, and hope became the only fire that refused to die. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more. The hut was small, no larger than a stable. Its walls, rough-hewn logs sealed with mud and straw, creaked under the pressure of the storm outside. The roof leaked in places, dripping melted frost into wooden bowls set along the floor. A faint fire struggled in the hearth, its glow soft and thin, and every crackle was like a sigh of exhaustion. The smoke clung low, weaving shadows against the beams, on a heap of straw, covered in patched furs and worn blankets. The family lay close, Thomas, the father, his arms around his wife, Eleanor, and their two children, William, aged 10, and little Margaret, no more than 6. Their breaths mingled, clouding the air, and Eleanor pressed her cheek against her daughter's hair, whispering soft prayers under her breath. For Thomas, the nights were the hardest. The day gave him purpose, splitting wood, fixing traps, foraging what little food could still be found beneath the snow. But at night, when the wind screamed against the walls and hunger twisted in the belly, he felt the helplessness that no axe, no courage, could fight. He often stared at his son and daughter, their thin frames, their lips pale from cold, and wondered if this winter was the one that would take them. They slept in layers, furs wrapped around straw mats, children between parents for warmth, cloaks spread on top to seal in what heat they could. At times, Thomas would wake in the black hours and pull William closer, his own body serving as a barrier against the frost. In the dark, Eleanor's hand would find his, her grip telling him what words could not. Hold on, do not give up. But that winter carried more than snow. It carried secrets. The village had suffered years of poor harvests. The famine gnawed at every household, turning once proud men into shadows of themselves. Bread was rationed, debts piled high, and whispers of theft haunted the air. Thomas had been among the strongest in the community once, respected for his honesty and hard labor. Yet even he felt shame pressing in, because hidden beneath the wooden floor of their hut was a sack of grain, taken not through trade or mercy, but through betrayal. Eleanor knew. She had discovered it one night when Thomas thought all were asleep. He had pried up the boards with trembling hands and tucked away the stolen sack. He hadn't seen her watching, her heart pounding as the truth sank in. He had stolen from their neighbor, John, a widower with no family, but a newborn grandson. Eleanor carried this secret like a burning coal in her chest. She loved Thomas, but every time she looked at him in the glow of the firelight, she saw not only the husband who had kept them alive, but the man who had taken from another family, condemning them to hunger. Forgiveness tangled with betrayal inside her, and yet she said nothing for their children's sake. As the storm raged, Thomas stirred. He rose quietly, careful not to wake the others, and added a few sticks of wood to the fire. The flame leapt, then faltered, as if mocking his efforts. He wrapped his cloak tighter and sat down, staring into the embers. In that fragile light, his face looked older, lined with years of toil and the weight of choices made in desperation. Behind him, Eleanor opened her eyes. She watched her husband, her heart aching with both love and anger. She wanted to reach out, to tell him she understood, that she knew the hunger that drove him, the fear that hollowed him. But another part of her wanted to demand why he chose betrayal instead of asking for help. The silence between them was heavy, broken only by the crackle of firewood. Suddenly, William stirred in his sleep, mumbling from a dream. Thomas leaned over, tucking the fur around him, brushing his son's hair from his face. It was such a tender act, so full of care, that Eleanor's chest tightened. He was a good father, he was a good man, but he was also a man who had crossed a line. The days stretched into weeks. Snow piled higher, cutting the village off from the outside world. The hut became both prison and sanctuary. Every night, they repeated the same ritual, gathering close, pressing together for warmth, sharing stories to keep the children distracted from the gnawing hunger. Sometimes Eleanor would tell tales of her childhood summers of green fields and rivers that sang in the sun. William would listen wide-eyed, and little Margaret would fall asleep with a faint smile on her lips. Yet behind the warmth of those stories, Eleanor's secret festered, and one night it broke free. The fire was low, and the wind screamed so fiercely that it felt the hut would be torn apart. Margaret was coughing in her sleep, her small body trembling. Eleanor, holding her close, looked at Thomas and whispered, "We cannot go on like this." Thomas frowned, pulling his cloak tighter. "We endure. That's all we can do." Her voice cracked. "Endure? With what? With stolen grain hidden beneath our floor, while others starve." The words struck like a hammer. William stirred, half awake, sensing the tension in his parents' voices. Thomas froze, his eyes darting to her in shock. I know, she said, tears welling. "I've known since the night you hid it. Do you think I cannot hear the boards creak beneath your feet?" His jaw tightened, shame burning through him. For a moment, he looked as though he might deny it. But then his shoulders sagged. "I did what I had to. Would you have me watch our children waste away? Would you have me bury them in the frozen ground because I lacked the courage to take what we needed?" Eleanor's tears fell silently. "And what of John, his grandson? Did you think they do not bleed? Do not hunger as we do?" Silence stretched, the kind that cuts deeper than words. Thomas turned away, his hand gripping the edge of the hearth until his knuckles whitened. He hated himself in that moment, not for the theft, but for the truth of what she said. William, now fully awake, whispered, "Father, is it true?" His voice was fragile, carrying the innocence of a boy forced to see the cracks in his hero. Thomas's heart broke. He wanted to deny it, to shield his son from the ugliness of survival, but the truth hung too heavy. Slowly, he nodded. "Yes, William, it is true." The boy's face twisted with confusion. "But you always said we must never steal. You said honesty is what makes a man." Thomas's throat tightened. "I know, my son, and I have failed you. I broke my own word because I feared losing you." The hut fell into a silence heavier than the storm outside. Eleanor turned her face away, clutching Margaret close, while William stared at the fire, his young eyes filled with a pain no child should carry. That night, they still slept huddled together, but something between them had shifted. The warmth of their bodies could not hide the cold truth that lay between husband and wife, father and son. And as the wind howled against the walls, Thomas lay awake, staring into the dark, wondering if survival was worth the price of his honor. Yet in the depth of that brutal winter, when every night felt like a test of the soul, the hardest choices were still to come. The storm did not ease in the days that followed. Snow buried the fields, the roofs, even the paths between huts. The world outside was white and endless, but inside, the wooden walls pressed in tighter with each passing night. The firewood stack dwindled, the food ran low, and the silence between Thomas and Eleanor grew heavier than the cold itself. William had not spoken much since that night. He watched his father, with a mixture of love and doubt, trying to reconcile the man who had carried him on his shoulders in summer with the man who had confessed to stealing. At 10 years old, childhood was slipping from him, replaced by the weight of knowledge he was too young to carry. He still curled close to his father at night for warmth, but he no longer reached for his hand in the same way. Margaret, too young to understand the arguments, clung to her mother. She coughed often now, her small body weakened by hunger and the biting air. Eleanor sat awake through many nights, holding her daughter, rocking her gently, whispering prayers into her hair. She did not speak of the grain again, but her silence was louder than words. It was on the third week of that endless storm that a knock came at their door. It was not a friendly knock, it was the heavy pounding of desperation. Thomas rose, his heart racing, and pulled the door open. There stood John, his neighbor, the widower whose grain Thomas had stolen. His face was hollow, his beard caked with frost, and in his arms he held his grandson, a baby wrapped in rags, its cries weak and thin. "Please," John rasped, his voice breaking. "I have nothing left, not a crust, not a coal. We will not last the night." Thomas's chest clenched. Behind him, Eleanor's breath caught, and William looked up sharply, eyes wide. The moment had come, the reckoning of his choices. For a heartbeat, Thomas could not move. His shame was a weight on his shoulders, crushing him. He looked into John's hollow eyes, and saw the reflection of his own fear, the same fear that had driven him to steal. And in that instant, he realized that survival was not only about protecting his own, but about what kind of man he chose to be. Without a word, he crossed the hut and lifted the boards beneath the straw bed. He pulled out the sack of grain, heavy and precious, and carried it back to the door. John's eyes widened, first in disbelief, then in fury. "You," he whispered, his voice shaking. "It was you." Eleanor lowered her gaze, tears sliding down her cheeks. William held his breath, staring at his father, as though the whole world balanced on what he would say next. Thomas bowed his head. "It was me. I wronged you, John. I took from you because I feared losing them. I have no excuse. Only this: take it back. Take it now. And forgive me, if you can." The silence that followed was unbearable. John's face twisted with anger, but also with exhaustion. He looked down at the baby in his arms, its tiny cries weakening, and his anger faltered. He grabbed the sack with trembling hands, clutching it to his chest. "You damned me, and this child," he said bitterly. But perhaps now you can make it right." Thomas nodded. "If there is more I can do, I will. Take my firewood, my tools, my hands, whatever you need." John stared at him for a long moment, then turned and trudged into the snow, the grain sack on his shoulder. The baby clutched close. When Thomas closed the door, Eleanor was weeping silently. William stood frozen, his young face pale, his voice breaking as he whispered, "You gave it all away. What will we eat now?" Thomas knelt before his son, gripping his shoulders. "We will endure, William, but I could not let another child die for our sake. Someday, you will understand that honor matters more than even bread." William's lips trembled, and he shook his head, torn between fear and pride. He wanted to be angry, but in his heart he knew his father was right. The days that followed were brutal. With no grain left, the family survived on scraps, roots dug from beneath the snow, a rabbit caught in one of Thomas's traps, melted snow water warmed over the fire. Hunger hollowed them, but something in the air had changed. The cold between husband and wife began to thaw. Eleanor, though still haunted by fear, felt her love for Thomas return, not because he had provided, but because he had chosen truth over secrecy. Yet Margaret grew weaker. Her cough deepened, and her small frame seemed to fade with every passing day. One night, when the wind screamed louder than ever, Thomas sat with her in his arms by the fire. She shivered even beneath the furs, her lips pale. Eleanor knelt beside them, her hands clasped in prayer. And then came another knock at the door. This time it was softer, hesitant. When Thomas opened it, he found John again, but his arms were empty. Behind him, in the snow, stood two other villagers, each carrying bundles. One held firewood, the other dried meat. John himself carried a small clay pot of broth, steaming in the night air. "I cannot let you suffer for my sake," John said, his voice thick with emotion. "What you did was wrong, but what you gave back was right. The others know. We will share what we have, meager as it is. None of us will survive if we do not stand together." Thomas's throat closed, his eyes burning. He stepped aside, and the men entered, laying their gifts by the fire. Eleanor covered her mouth with trembling hands as the smell of broth filled the hut. William stared, wonder lighting his face for the first time in weeks. Margaret sipped the broth that night, her small body trembling with relief as the warmth spread through her. Thomas and Eleanor watched with tears, holding each other close. For the first time, hope flickered in their hearts, not because the storm had ended, but because they were no longer alone. The weeks dragged on, but with the village sharing what little each family could spare, they endured. Hunger never left them, but unity gave them strength. When the first hints of spring finally appeared, the drip of melting snow, the first bird called, the villagers emerged from their huts, like survivors of a war. On the day the thaw began, Thomas stood outside with William at his side. They looked at the fields, muddy and lifeless, yet full of promise. William slipped his hand into his father's for the first time in many weeks. "Father," he whispered, "I think I understand now. It is not enough to survive. We must survive as men, not as thieves." Thomas's eyes filled with pride, and he pulled his son close. "Yes, William, you see it now." Eleanor stepped out, Margaret in her arms, her cheeks finely pink with returning health. She smiled faintly at her husband, and for the first time in months, Thomas felt the warmth of her forgiveness. They had faced the brutal winter, just with furs and fire, but with sacrifice, with confession, and with the courage to mend what was broken. And though the memory of hunger would never leave them, it had also taught them the greatest truth, that survival is not only about keeping breath in the body, but about keeping honor in the soul. As the snow melted and the village stirred with new life, Thomas stood with his family at the doorway of their wooden hut. The storm had passed, but the bond between them had grown stronger than any winter could break. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe.